Good praying still for Aaron and praying for Rick and Andy as they go off to Ghana this week. It's literally on the other side of the world. I am blessed this morning to bring you a message. I know last week, I don't think Larry's here. Larry brought us a pretty solid message regarding Boaz. And it was funny, I was looking through the lineage as spoken in Matthew, and I realized, wait a minute, I'm talking about his mom this morning. So I actually thought that was kind of apparent to know. We've been calling this series like a character sketches. And don't make a mistake, don't get caught up in the language there. These aren't like fictional characters in some novel. These are real people that existed in the history. So we're actually looking at real people in their history here. And I thought it'd be fitting. I like to tell stories, so bear with me. I've blessed my parents are here this morning. So I started working on this sermon, I think, back in August. So I actually didn't know they'd be here this morning, but I think it's perfect that they're here this morning. Oh, yeah. So when I was a kid, I think I was roughly 12 or 13 years old, my parents had this idea of going to Cooperstown. Baseball Hall of Fame, right? We lived in New Hampshire growing up, Baseball Hall of Fame. So my mother didn't really like minivans. They were recently married, my parents, my mother and my stepfather. So we rented the Chevy Caprice. If you don't remember the Chevy Caprice, like those were like the station wagon type cars, had the woody wagon on the side, you had two people up front, you got people in the middle, and then you had the two seats in the way back, right, looking backwards down the road. And that's where I sat. I think I was 6'3" at the time, because that's where you want to sit, in the way back, without any of the wheel well there, looking down the highway of I-90. Being that it's 2024 now, I decided to go check Google Maps, and Google Maps says it was 242 miles in a 4-hour drive. I am telling you, it was forever. Felt like the Oregon Trail, actually. My brothers and I venturing across New York through Vermont. But we got to the Hall of Fame. I remember being enamored with, you see like Babe Ruth's bat. You see his baseball glove. You see all of these figures in the hall of all these famous baseball players that kind of existed through time. And I think quite a few people, I would think, are infatuated with halls of fame. Right? We love Hall of Fame. We love kind of seeing people like the best of the best type situation, which, got me thinking what kind of halls of fame are there out there. Had some fun with this. There's an Alabama Jazz Hall of Fame. In case you're a big jazz fans out there, head on down there. 1970, there was a Songwriters Hall of Fame created in Nashville, Tennessee. So you can go and visit the greatest songwriters, apparently, of the United States. There was a Caddy Hall of Fame founded in 1999. I don't really understand what that one is. Here's what I found was interesting. 1995, get this, an International Towing and Recovery Hall of Fame. This is real. These are real places. This is their little slogan. It says, when your car calls it quits on the side of the road, the tow truck driver who comes to the rescue is a modern knight in shining armor. Since 1995, the International Towing and Recovery Hall of Fame and Museum has chronicled the history of towing and recovery and honored the pros who have made big contributions to the industry, including towing operators who lost their lives in the line of service. I could go on, but I think it's probably a good place to start here, or end. Just going to move? There we go. Point being, there's different types of halls of fame out there, and this morning I want to talk about Rahab. Rahab is actually one of the people mentioned in actually what's called the Hall of Faith. If you actually go to the book of Hebrews, instead of some people making up halls of fame about baseball players who passed on, or by tow truck drivers, apparently, who have serviced our country in towing up, vehicles in blizzards, probably. Do you know God himself names out certain people in his own hall of fame of people that he feels are, due to their faith, are remembered together as faithful stewards of his word and faithful followers of God. So that's where I wanted to sort of jump in today. Also had some fun up here in the last few weeks in the fact of I knew we were doing these kind of messages about people. Has anybody else had the same thought that I had back here in the first one? Which one's who? Okay, thank you. The fellow people, which one's who? So when Aaron sent me the slide deck this morning, I was like, I knew it! I knew that was Rahab up there. I knew it. But we have a hall of faith, actually, written in Hebrews 11, actually. And if you look at Hebrews 11, I'll actually start off in verse 1, actually. It says, "And now is faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. By faith we understand that the universe was created by God and the Word of God." Then we see God in the author of Hebrews kind of list out. So hang with me for just a minute here. Look at this. We got, in verse 4, it says, "By faith Abel." You got Abel mentioned. Verse 5, "By faith Enoch was taken so he should not be seen death. By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, and reverent fear connected in the ark." We got Abraham here mentioned in verse 8. "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called out to the place by which to receive an inheritance. By faith," in verse 9, "he went to live in the land of promise." Verse 11, "By faith Sarah herself received power to conceive." We sort of have these verses from 13, and I could read them all, but I want to be a little mindful of time this morning. But I want to jump to verse 17. It says, "By faith Abraham." Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. By faith Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith Jacob, when he's dying, blessed each of his sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of staff. By faith Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of his exodus to the Israelites. We keep seeing the author of Hebrews mention, by faith this person, by faith this person, by faith this person. And then we get to verse 23, and he starts talking about Moses. Right? We see Moses mentioned 4 times in these verses, right? By faith Moses, by faith Moses, by faith he left Egypt, by faith he kept the Passover. Moses, you could probably say, is a pretty strong figure in Bible history as far as someone pretty consistent with their following in faith. And then it says here in verse 29, right? "By faith the people crossed the Red Sea as dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned." And then it says here, "By faith Rahab, the prostitute." So we see these listed people. I mean, we mentioned a whole bunch of them, right? Then all of a sudden, from Abraham to Moses to everyone in between, you now have Rahab being mentioned. Rahab is mentioned in the same vein as all of these other people. And I find it fitting that this morning we're going to sort of take a little bit of dive. Holly read through Joshua chapter 2 as far as what her background was, but fit on how God uses all people in all ways to follow, and all he's asking for you to do is follow him faithfully. So that's the purpose statement this morning, is I want to look at her and say, look, God can use and will use anyone. All he asks is for us to follow him faithfully. There's a number of people in this room this morning from all different places in life. I think, Andy, you mentioned it this morning, right? Perhaps you're coming in, you're having a good day. There's other folks coming in here with some baggage. Other folks, maybe it was a tough week, tough morning. Maybe it was a tough last hour. Maybe it's been a tough year. However, God says faithfully, I will use everybody who wants to come and follow me faithfully. So that's sort of the backdrop in which we're jumping into this morning. So before we get to chapter 2, there is a chapter 1 that happens before chapter 2 in Joshua. I thought about we could read first 2 chapters. I'm like, oh, you're going to be up here forever. It'll be like noon before we actually get to the sermon part. But jumping into it, if we actually look at Joshua chapter 1, and I don't know if you can read that up there. But it says, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, go up over the Jordan. Right? My servant is dead. I kind of view this as like a next man up. Right? Moses had this incredible campaign. Right? And God says, hey Joshua, Moses is dead. Let's go. Let's go on. Get up. What are you doing? Instead of just reading every single verse, picking up in verse 3, it says, every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness in this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, to the great sea toward the great going down to the sun, shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Just park on that for a minute, right? Like God, like Moses is dead, Joshua kind of, you're up, and God gives him this amazing commendation, right? Can you just picture, like, you got this huge army, all right, or a group of people, right? You got the Israelite nation, right, being marched through the wilderness. You got Moses leading them on, and Moses dies, and he says, hey, Joshua, you're up. It's no wonder that God says to him so many times, be strong and courageous. I would be pleading to God, give me some courage and help to lead a whole army, all right, or a whole group of people. Be strong and courageous. And he didn't just say it once, right? He says in what? Verse 6, be strong and courageous. 7, be strong and courageous. We see it again there, I think what? Verse 9, right? Be strong and courageous. And then we actually see, look at the people's response, right? It says here, and they answered Joshua, all that you've commanded us, we will do. This is the people's response. He says to Joshua, get up, go, be strong and courageous, follow me, you're up. And the people listen and respond to him. It says, and they answered, all you commanded us, we will do. Wherever you send us, we will go, just as we obeyed Moses in all things. And then what did the people say back to Joshua? Hey, God be with you, be strong and courageous. All right? That is the context behind Joshua chapter 1. And so what happens in Joshua chapter 2, right? It opens up and says, Joshua the son of Nun sent in 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, go and view the land, especially Jericho. Got me thinking, right? All right, well, it seems very strategic, right? Joshua is not just some bystander. He'd been walking with Moses for a number of years, clearly, right? So Joshua says, hey, spies, go in and go scope out Jericho. And so the spies sort of come in. And I think it's important to note as well, if you actually go back to Numbers, I thought this was interesting. So bear with me. If you give me 5 months to prepare a sermon, I want to find some interesting things I want to share. But Numbers 13, if you go back to Numbers 13, Moses did the same thing. Numbers 13, verses 1 through 3 says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel from each tribe of their fathers. You send a man, every one a chief among them. So Moses sent them out from the wilderness of Paran, according to the command of the Lord, all of them who were heads of the people of Israel. Then you see in kind of verses 4, I think all the way to 16 or 17, all these different tribes mentioned, right? One in particular, if your thumb's there, in verse 8, one of the people mentioned that were one of the spies was this person named Hosea, the son of Nun. All right? But now let's skip down to verse 16. Now, Rick, so you're already nodding your head. You know where I'm going with this. Going on to verse 16. These were the names of the men who of Moses to spy out thy land. And Moses called Hosea, the son of Nun, Joshua. Joshua had been part of the Moses campaign. He'd seen this strategic approach before. He had been a spy before, essentially, right? And now he's come to Jericho with this group of the Israelites saying, I'm going to send 2 spies out. I'm simply saying this is not something new. This is a strategy he learned by being with Moses and being part of, God's people. So the spies go in, and they end up going to where? They go to the house of Rahab, right? It says, then they went and came to the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab and lodged there. I like to travel. I go to a number of hotels. I'm the lover of a good free breakfast out there. Hampton Inn's got a great one. I always find myself eating that, biscuits and gravy thing that I would never eat ever or make at my house ever. But when I'm traveling, that's what I pick on. And no show of hands, but I'm sure there's other folks in the room who probably feel the same thing. I know there's a few people who love biscuits and gravy, but I don't even know what it is. So this gelatinous thing with like sausage in there. But we eat it. And I go and check in, right? We go and check in at any hotel, the bellhop or whomever, the concierge comes out. What's usually the first thing they say to you? How are you? Where are you from? Right? Most hotels you go to, it's almost like they're trained and indoctrinated as part of like the Marriott training program. Make sure you ask every single person where they're coming from. So you come in there and you always simply want to ask, where are you from? Which kind of got me thinking, like, is the first thing is like the question you might want to ask yourself is, why did the spies choose to go there? Right? Wouldn't that be a normal question? Why would the spies choose to go to a house of a prostitute named Rahab? And I was thinking on that, I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure when they went and checked in, there was no bellhop there checking them in, asking where they were from. Just from a simple, like, you're going to a place that's probably meant for discretion to a certain level. Fair? I would say fair. So the spies come in, hopefully very little fanfare, not many questions were asked, and they end up going to this place of a house of a prostitute named Rahab, who was living in Jericho. I was talking to Christina about this, and I was like, I think growing up as a, as a Sunday school kid, kudos to my parents who sent me to Sunday school growing up. I sort of feel like Jericho is sort of like that Sunday school lesson, like similar to Noah, right? Where it's like Noah's Ark as a kid, you think of like the cartoon characters bouncing through the ocean and everything's so happy. That's not what Noah's Ark was like, right? But you think about Jericho, and it's what's the song, right? Joshua hit the battle of Jericho. Everyone's got that song in their head. You think it's some like fun little thing, and the walls came a tumbling down. No! Jericho was not a very nice place. Shocking, right? You had prostitution, you had houses of prostitutes built on the walls. Okay, at least let's just lead with that. If you actually look at the city of Jericho, it kind of was a strategic location, actually. It was kind of built within sort of like these mountain ranges. And if you wanted to come into the promised land, Jericho was where you had to go. It was sort of like the main stop along the way. If you look at the city, it sort of was it's one of the first big cities that really prided itself on its big walls and its big construct and its big structure. And that it was, for the Amorite kingdom, essentially. That was kind of why it was built. And it's a big, formidable, city. And they came to our house, which is something. I saw this picture somewhere online. I didn't draw it, but it was like, oh, that gives me a visual in my head, right? We see in verse 15, it says here, then she let them through the wall, and how their house was built on top of the city wall. So that's where they're going. That's the house. That's the backdrop. That's the context. So you got these two spies coming in. If I go back here, it says they're crossing over that Jordan River right there. They're crossing through the river, coming into the city, and to the city of Jericho. And where do they go? A place that doesn't ask very many questions, a place that won't seem to want to push back too much on them, a house of a prostitute named Rahab. That's the context that sort of brings us into this story. And if you don't know why they came there, if you don't know where the city is, I think it loses a little bit as far as what the whole story of Rahab is actually about. So who was Rahab? Well, I think when we first meet Rahab, right, we don't have a lot of positive attributes, right? It's the house of a prostitute named Rahab. Hebrews 11, right, even calls it the prostitute Rahab. And I was telling the elders this morning on how this has been a fascinating, if you go study this out, there's so many false commentators out there that will try to some sort of spin or justify the language. They'll say things like, oh, she was an innkeeper. She just maintained the house of ill repute. That's what they were saying. I mean, you chuckle, these are real things. These are commentators like to put this out. Let me put my foot down, though, and sort of do a mic drop moment. If you go to Hebrews 11:13, all right, it says the prostitute Rahab. If you look at the word prostitute in the Greek, guess what it is? I'll tell you what it is. Porneia is literally the word. The porneia is the name of, if you look at the word porneia, it literally means prostitute or harlotry. And it says here, a harlot or one who yields herself to defilement for the sake of gain. Good luck putting that in the public news spin cycle and trying to find a way to spin that to your liking. It's probably not going to work. But that is who, good sound, should be good? All right. But that's whose house they went to. And if you look at verse 10, it says, for we have heard the Lord has dried up the water in the Red Sea before you. So she wasn't just somebody who, she was an educated person here. Educated mean educated with the events of what the Israelite army had been doing. It wasn't like she woke up that morning and looked out the window and was like, Israelites are coming here. Might as well jump on the God bandwagon. No, that is not actually what happened. She starts mentioning things here. We've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you. We heard you came out of Egypt. We heard what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan. Like, she knew of different things. And if you look at Bible history, right, these weren't events that happened like last week or yesterday. It wasn't like, news flash. These things all just happened yesterday. No, these were events that happened over, last few years of time. So she was educated in what was going on. She was clearly a profiteer, right? She was profiting off the sin and defilement of a city. However, if you look at her response, what does she do? She welcomes in the two spies into her house. Kind of like a little bit of a surprise moment, one would say, right? Prostitute takes in these two spies into her house. MacArthur says this, it says, her sudden expression of faith, therefore, is not only unexpected, it seems rather counterintuitive to every instinct that would motivate a woman like Rahab. Her motivations were countercultural. It's not what she did. And in my mind here, I think really you have these spies that come in. You have three options, really. I think she had three options. Option one is she could have reported them to the leaders of the city. Clearly they were out looking for him, right? We see that in verse 2. Probably would have gotten a handsome reward. Probably would have been commended. So that's option one. Option two, she could have done nothing. Could have sat idle. Something, we see other people in the Bible too sometimes, right, where they kind of sit on their hands and do nothing. She easily just could have sort of let them come and go, and none would have been the wiser, right? She could have sort of done her thing. Or option three, she could take action, which makes you wonder, what was at risk? Everything was at risk. What if she'd been caught? Beat, tortured, murdered, penalty to death? Probably lost her business. Easy to say. She put a lot out there at risk. Now, I think one thing folks like to bring up in the story of Rahab, right, is to say, well, didn't she lie to the people? How do you justify that? We can't overlook the fact that she lied. But what I'll say to you, did God actually endorse her lying behavior? Never in Scripture do we see where God commends lying. Never in Scripture do we see that God commended it. However, let me be clear here. God uses a person living in a pagan world whose life was a house of a prostitute purveyor to do his will. So we come back to our purpose statement this morning. God can use anybody to do anything for him. It's a broad spectrum there of who God can use. Point being is, I think God's used plenty of sinful people in the Bible for all different circumstances, all for his kingdom. And unless you're studying Jesus Christ himself, I can almost assure you there's nobody else in the Bible that lived a sinless lifestyle. And if you focus on the lie, you lose track of what the main goal and point of Rahab actually is God used her within her faithfulness to follow him. But let's look at her testimony here in verse 8. All right? So this is where you actually see Rahab's heart a little bit more. Verse 8 says, before the men lay down, she came up to them to the roof and said to them. So she comes up to them. They're hidden on the roof, right? She hid them in her house, up on the roof. Her house is built on top of the wall, which probably makes sense, right? What better way to survey a town is being built up on a wall? What better way to keep track of what's going on in the city of Jericho than to be perched up on the rooftop of a wall of a house being built there? But she comes up and says, look, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and the fear you has fallen upon us, and all that the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. She comes and says, I know the Lord has given you the land. I know who God is, who he says he is. He says that again, right? The Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens and above and on the earth as it is beneath. So this first observation, right, is, she knows God has given him the land. Observation 2 is she knows the strength of the Lord. She didn't just wake up this morning with this moment of having some epiphany. She'd been seeing God work. She'd been seeing what God has done. She'd been seeing God navigate his entire plan unfolded in the course of history. Then the third observation, it might seem small, but look at this. I thought this was interesting. Verse 10, for we have heard. Who's we? We like to focus on Rahab. Let's not overlook the fact she's talking in we's and us's, right? We heard this. Our hearts melted. To the point where, look, she's asking for grace. It says here that you will save alive my father, my mother, my brothers and sisters, and who belong to them, and you deliver our lives from death. I would say the we's and the us's of her family, and obviously those close-knit to her. So she wasn't someone that had a closed-door faith, despite her lifestyle, unfortunately. Let's look at the spies' response. What do they say? Verse 14 says, and the men said to her, our life for yours, even to death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. And one thing they mention here is in verse, 18. Behold, when you come into the land, you shall tie this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and you shall gather into your house your father and your mother and your brothers and all your father's household. Then if anyone goes out of the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head, and we shall be guiltless. But if a hand is laid on anyone who is with you in this house, his blood shall be on our head. So what are they doing? Let's not get lost in the weeds here. He's placed a scarlet cord outside your window. What color is scarlet? Red. Scarlet, red, bright red. And he says, here, hang it outside your window. I feel as though there's a message there. Scarlet window, doorpost maybe, symbolizing blood, covering certain. We'll come back to that. I feel like there's something there. We'll come back to that, I promise, at the end. All right? So you have Rahab having this entire interaction in the Old Testament, right? Her whole story laid out. She basically puts it all on the line, helps the spies out, and essentially they help go on into the Promised Land. Well, actually help her take down Jericho. Right? Then we see her response that she sent them away, and they departed, and they tied the scarlet cord. So she actually follows through and ties the scarlet cord, right? So let's jump over to the New Testament just for a bit, because I think Rahab's actually mentioned 3 times in the New Testament, right? We see her mentioned in Hebrews. We see her mentioned as far as the genealogy of Jesus, actually. Again, she gave birth to Boaz, and we see Boaz, the line of all the way back and giving birth to Jesus here. But we also see her mentioned in James chapter 2. Okay, so we'll flip over to James chapter 2, and picking it up here, and just to give you a little bit of context, right? 7 to 10 years or so after Jesus' death, James, half-brother of Jesus, writes this epistle. If you go there, if you're in there right now, it's on the verse behind you here. Verse 23 says, and the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And the same way was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way. For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, and so faith apart from works is dead. Isn't it great we went through the whole history of who Rahab is, and hopefully that weight of that verses means so much more now? But I think sometimes we get kind of caught up, well, I'll come back to that. We get caught up in that word justified. Let me be clear on something. Works don't save you. All right? I think sometimes we see this word justified up there, and we kind of think it's like the actions that are actually coming out and saving us or something. I don't. There's been a lot of, I'll say, plenty of commentators written on this. Probably the same people who wrote the, Rahab is the innkeeper. But you look at the word justified, it actually is from a Greek word tikaio, which means to show, exhibit, evidence, or one's to be righteousness. It is essentially the evidence that what you have is true. Example would be like the wind, right? We can't see the wind, but we can see what the wind does. In fact, I can see the grass kind of moving out there a little bit and the tree weeds blowing. Like a good example that faith is essentially, it's what, chapter 11, verse 1 of Hebrews, right? The evidence of things not seen. So James gives this illustration of Abraham as far as his testimony of what his faith it looks like. And then he actually says in verse 25 this, and in the same way. I love language. If you got a Bible in front of you, some of you might see the word likewise in there. Don't actually look at it and see what the NIV says on that word. However, if you look at what the word actually says for that beginning part, it actually says in the exact same manner, likewise in the same way. The author of James is comparing a direct contrast or a direct example. Say, look, just like Abraham was like this, so isn't Rahab just like this. I find that fascinating, right? I mean, in the same way, you got this contrast between Abraham and Rahab written up here. Would you ever think that Abraham and Rahab were one and the same? I see hopefully some heads nodding a little bit. No? He compares them as the same. Because what is the currency to which he is looking at? It's by the faith to which they follow the Lord. By the faith to which they follow Christ. Right? And you couldn't find two more opposite people. You got a Jew. I go this side, sorry. This side. You got a Jew. You got a Gentile. You got a man, you got a woman. You got a worldly, a good man, a worldly woman. A noble Chaldean, a degraded harlot. You got a leader, right? A leader. God promises his people to Abraham. You got an insignificant, kind of quiet follower, runs an innkeeper of a prostitute. Top of the social order, at the bottom. Divine guidance from God, really just guided by our faith, really indirect guidance from God. Literally, it says, called a friend of God, and she was living in a pagan world, living a pagan lifestyle. So when I say to you that God can use anybody to further his name and walk according to his plan, and that all he wants is your faith to follow, I have to believe between Abraham and Rahab, everyone in this room fits somewhere within that spectrum. Doesn't matter if you're 5 years old or up to however. Like, you fit within that spectrum. And I think that's one of the key messages that Rahab wants to give us this morning. That God says, look what I did with Rahab in the faith to which she followed me. Look what I've done with Abraham to which she followed me. Follow me. Which is application point number one. God can and will use anyone to further his name. You are vehicles, you are vessels for him to go out and further his name in a dark, dark world. A dark world which is today ridden with political text messages and emails and voicemails. 24/7. I promised my mother I wouldn't talk anything politics up here. I'm not, but it's like, enough. Probably get back to my seat. I got 12 of them probably sitting in there. If you're looking for a perfect world, I assure you it's not it. That's why God's word says our citizenship is in heaven. That's where our actual citizenship belongs. And what God says, look, follow me faithfully. Look at Rahab. All she did was follow me in faith and put everything on the line. Look at other people God used as well, right? Just take a mental note, right? Tax collectors, right? Matthew. Fishermen, clearly, not too much high in the social order there. I love Amos, right? What was Amos's profession? Goat herder. He was a goat herder. A few weeks ago, I know Aaron, I hope he's listening from home, he taught on Jonah. A pessimistic, not very great prophet, did very little, but God did so much through him. Purpose being is God doesn't need a lot, he just wants you to follow him and obey. Second thing is by faith alone. Rick's been leading us through the book of Ephesians. It's been a joy. If you haven't been part of our Sunday school class, please come. It's been a great time. We've now taken, I'm very proud of you, Rick. It's been like 8 weeks now, and you're only in chapter 3 or 4. Elders love to give me a hard time because I take forever to go through anything, which is probably not wrong. But Ephesians chapter 2 says this. It says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God. Not a result of works that no one may boast, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk by them." By faith alone. And then not being idle, right? We thought back to what could Rahab have done? She could have turned the spies in. She could have sat on her hands. I mean, part of the reason they give me a wireless mic is I have a hard time sitting still. Don't be idle. God doesn't want idleness, right? We read in Revelations, right? If you are lukewarm, I'll vomit you from my mouth, right? Like, not being good for anything is being an idol. I-D-L-E. And then lastly, let's be reminded by the scarlet cord here, which we realized yesterday that Aaron wasn't here, and we're kind of like, who's going to lead communion today? I was like, oh, seems like a natural segue here. But what does the scarlet cord represent, right? I mean, she really hung a scarlet cord, but we can look back on it and say, look, by hanging the scarlet cord out there, what did the army do? They passed over her house. If there ever was probably a house that you wanted to go into a city and destroy, probably was a house of prostitution, because you probably think it didn't really need to be there. Point being is a little bit of blood can cover a lot of anything, which I feel is a natural segue as we look at communion this morning. As we approach a cross where Jesus gave it all, we really did nothing on our end for it. And all he's asking for us to do is trust and faith in him. So as we close this morning, some things to put on your heart today is, how is your faith in your walk this morning? Is it idle? I haven't gone very far. It's some sitting still. Like, you have an example in the Bible of someone who gave it all and put it all out there. Perhaps your walk feels heavy. Trust in the Lord. Perhaps you're sitting idle. Seek God. But be comforted and know that by grace you have been saved and nothing else on your own. And with that, I hope you're encouraged this morning. And I'm not sure who's up next week as far as what person we're looking at, but I think Rahab has been you jump into a verse and you say, wait, God compares a prostitute to Abraham? How does that work out? Well, hopefully that kind of works it out in your mind a little bit better this morning, and realize that God uses all things together for his name, for all good, for him.